Good morning to each and every one of you. Thank you very much for your presence here today. It's an overwhelming presence, and I'm so glad that the University of Macerata responded this warmly to the invitation we've extended to one of the leading scholars in many fields, at the intersection of many fields, who's going to talk to us today and in the next 2 days about populism and democracy. This will take place in the framework of the Alberico Gentili Lectures, which is an annual appointment involving distinguished academics, legal scholars, and judges from all over the world that deliver 3 unprecedented lectures on a comparative constitutional law topic. Let me spend a few words about this genius loci, Alberico Gentili. He was a native of San Ginesio, a place very close to Macerata. He was a Protestant dissident who in the late 16th century escaped from this area because of the religious persecution he suffered and ended up teaching civil law at Oxford University, becoming one of the first European scholars in public international law. His experience as an immigrant forced to flee from his hometown for his diversity and the religious minority he belonged to gave us the idea of these annual meetings and the idea of exploring themes of diversity in the field of comparative constitutional law. Let me just give you an idea of the scholars that have preceded Professor Sadusky delivering the Alberico Gentili lectures that were inaugurated in 2012 by Guido Calabresi, former dean of the Yale Law School and senior judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. After him, some of the most prestigious jurists of our time followed. Giuliano Amato, former president of the Italian Constitutional Court, Christopher McCrudden, one of the leading experts in human rights law from Oxford University and Michigan Law School, Daphne Barak Erez, one of the justices of the Israeli Supreme Court, Silvana Shara, incumbent president of the Italian Constitutional Court, Sonia Sotomayor, associate justice of the United States Supreme Court, Yves Meny, former president of the European University Institute, Edwin Cameron, former justice of the South African Constitutional Court. This year is the 10th edition of this lectureship, and what a guest for this milestone. Let me introduce to you properly our outstanding keynote speaker, who has so generously accepted our invitation. Professor Wojciech Sadusky is Challis Professor in Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney Law School. He also holds a position of professor in the Center for Europe in the University of Warsaw. Over the years, he's been visiting professor at the Cardozo Law School in New York, at the University of Trento, and at the Yale Law School. Additionally, he was Strauss Fellow and Global Visiting Professor of Law at the New York University. He has taught in many universities in Europe, Asia, and the United States. He was also professor of legal theory and philosophy of law in the Department of Law of the European University Institute in Florence, and served as head of that Department of Law between 2003 and 2006. Member of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia since 1990, he is member of many editorial boards, including the European Law Journal, Politics, Philosophy and Economics, and the Law and Philosophy Library with the international publisher Springer Scientific. In 2013, he initiated and led the Myanmar Constitutional Reform project. His scientific production is intimidating in both quality and quantity. I'll restrict myself to the books of the past 10 years published with the most prestigious international publishing houses. Constitutionalism and the Enlargement of Europe, 2012. Human Rights, Old Problems, New Possibilities, 2013. Rights Before Courts, a study of constitutional courts in post-communist states of Central and Eastern Europe, 2014. Poland's Constitutional Breakdown in 2019. Legitimacy, the State and Beyond, 2019. Public Reason and Courts, 2020. Anti-constitutional populism, 2022. And also this year, a pandemic of populists. Wojciech Sadurski is a vocal critic of the Law and Justice political party in Poland, which has sued him 3 times for his ideas. Hundreds of law professors signed a letter in his support, stating that there was a coordinated harassment campaign by the Polish ruling party against a well-known and respected academic who has clearly struck a nerve with his powerful critique of the situation in his native country. I couldn't think today of a better scholar to address these lectures topic, that is populist challenge to democracy. So I'm sure you'll join me in a warm and grateful round of applause to salute and welcome at the University of Macerata, Wojciech Sadurski.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Barbizan, and thank you, all of you that you came here to listen to what I have to say about populism. Let me say how incredibly grateful I am to the University of Macerata, and especially to Professor Barbizan, who extended this invitation to me. I'm very happy at different levels. First of all, because I had actually visited Macerata many years ago, invited here by the then rector of this university and my collaborator in one of the projects, Professor Alberto Febraio. I spent only a few hours here, that is an evening and night and then the next morning. And I kept remembering that it must be the most beautiful university in the world. I mean, people know that it is a very distinguished place of research and teaching, but the beauty of the place, you know, I kept having it in mind as some sort of fairy tale place. So I dreamt about visiting it again. I'm also very happy to, in a sense, follow in the footsteps, if I may say so, of a number of distinguished lecturers in this Alberico Gentili lecture series, because as Professor Barbizan was enumerating them, I realized that I know some of them quite well. The most recent lecturer, Professor UniMc, was both my boss and my friend at the European University Institute, which is not a usual combination. You know, if your friend becomes then your boss, then it's a recipe for disaster. But somehow, although we had some disagreement of a professional nature, we maintained our friendship, and I actually have, before, when preparing these lectures for here, I had read some of the most recent writings of UniMc, and it will become clear when I go ahead how greatly I was influenced by him. I was also connected with Professor Giuliana Amato, who was here, of course, and in a sense, because when I was head of department in Florence, I pressed UniMc, already mentioned, that we should really invite and appoint Professor Amato as our visiting professor. It's not the usual thing for the Institute to have visiting professors, but I pressed Yves and he agreed. And I remember that Professor Amato kept coming every Monday. That was his free day, even though he was vice president at the time of the Convention on the Future of Europe, and also Minister of Interior of Italy. And I remember once he gave me a lift in his car with his bodyguards from city center in Florence to San Domenico di Fiesole. And I will never forget that drive. You know, I thought I would die. You know, I mean, these were professional drivers driving the Minister of Interior, a very sort of, in a difficult time in Italy. So he had this extra protection, but the drive was really something to remember. And also Chris McRadden, whom Professor Barbizan mentioned, was my colleague and friend in New York, and of course Guido Calabresi. I had actually met him several times in New York. So, okay, enough of this name dropping. I just want to say that I feel here very much at home because many of, and Silvana Sciarra, by the way, the ex-president of the Constitutional Tribunal, she had been my colleague in the European University Institute in Florence as well. So I feel a little bit of being an insider here rather than completely outsider. But perhaps the most important reason why I'm so pleased and feel so privileged to be here is because of the name of these lectures and because of Alberico Gentili. This invitation gave me an occasion to read some of his work and about him. And I would like to begin with this quote from Alberico Gentili, the sentence which is often quoted, and I would like to use it as a motto for this series of lectures, because I feel that it's one of the most beautiful of all passages in this humanistic, universalistic Enlightenment tradition. All the universe this union of ours is like an arch of stones, which will fall unless the stones hold one another up. Is there anything more beautiful than that? And this passage is in direct contrast with the ideology and movements and governments which I'll be discussing over these 3 days. For them, in contrast to this idea of common humanity and community of people, what matters is the difference, polarization, factionalism, and also pretending that one group, one section of the society in some ways can be privileged and can be used as a synonym of the totality of a given society. So populism, the way I will be presenting it in some detail, is a direct contrast, direct rejection of this beautiful sentence by Alberico Gentili, which I have just read. So let me tell you briefly what is my plan for these 3 days. Today, let's treat it a little bit as an introductory part. I will try to convince you that the issue is very topical, that especially these days, and maybe not just because of the elections of the 25th of September in this country, but more generally, this is a right time to think seriously about populism and what sort of threat it poses to our democracies. I will introduce my notion of populism and I will explain where I stand in my study of populism compared to other writers and other scholars who research this topic. And most importantly, I will introduce an idea of the sources of populisms in plural, with an S at the end. Because I will try to convince you that there is not a single populism, that there are different populisms which respond to different pressures, anxieties, and demands that people make on their political systems. And therefore, we should be very nuanced, very subtle when it comes to talking about populisms, and we really should use the plural. This is the plan for today. Tomorrow will be a little bit more legal than today. Therefore, the approach will be more on law than on political science. And I'll be talking about populist constitutions and institutions. What populism do to and with constitutions, and what do they do to the institutions, mainly to democratic institutions, because that is what this series of lectures is focused on. And in the third day, on Thursday, I will talk about three seemingly separate issues. The first one will be on populist speech or populist talk or populist discourse or populist narratives. I will listen carefully with you what and how populists use language for their purposes. Then I will spend some time on talking about what was the record of populist governments in dealing with COVID pandemic. And the end, perhaps understandably enough, will be about the future. What are the ways out? If, as I believe, populism is a disease, what is the cure? Is there any remedy or therapy? Or how can we counteract it? And when and if it has already happened, how can we get out of this mess? So let me begin by introducing the reasons why it is important to talk about populism today in late 2022. And that there are several reasons. First of all, because generally populism is part of a larger phenomenon, a very worrying trajectory in the developments, and one has to add decline of democracy worldwide. You see on this slide a cover of the most recent report of one of the most prestigious, reliable, dependable centers of study of democracy, which is called VDEM, Varieties of Democracies, in University of Gothenburg. And they do both qualitative and quantitative study of evolution of democracy. But there are many other studies like this by other important centers, by, for example, Freedom House, by The Economist and their think tank. And they all converge on this rather sad statement: democracy is these days in decline. So this most recent report, the cover of which you see on this slide and which has been released only a few months ago, suggests that, to put it broadly, democracy is at its lowest state over the last 25 years. That while the number of countries which have undergone democratization in 2021 is 13, the number of countries which have undergone a negative development, that is a decline of the democracy, is 31. So almost 3 as many countries where democracy declined as those which can be called democratizers. And perhaps the most worryingly, even 2011 49%, nearly half of the world population lived in autocratic states, that is, states which are deeply non-democratic. Today, the number is 70%. 70% of population of the world live in non-democratic states of different gravity, so to speak, of defects of democracy. So these numbers do not lie, and then important, not entire, of course, 70%, but a large percent of this population lives in the countries which I will call populist. Of course, that means that you have to suspend the judgment, so to speak, about whether I'm right or wrong, up to the point in which I will tell you what I mean by populist states and populist governments. But for the time being, let's just retain one other assessment by VDEM, that is that 2/3 of cases of decline of democracy have been produced by democratically elected leaders. So 2/3. So a large majority of dismantlement of democracy has been managed by those who came to power democratically, rather than through a coup d'etat, civil war, or simply had inherited a non-democratic system from the incumbents. So this is the most fundamental reason, I think, why it is important to talk about populism today. Another aspect of it is that in some of the countries in which democracy, in which sort of populists came to power, populist systems became consolidated. And by consolidation, I mean something relatively technical. In political science, a system becomes consolidated if it continues throughout the second and third electoral term. So that we see countries in which populists have not only been elected to power, but have been re-elected, as in Poland, and re-elected, that is for the third time, as in Hungary or before in India. But I will focus largely on Poland. So this consolidation has some important effects. Let me read to you a little passage from a wonderful book on which Evmeni had spoken here last year, Popolo ma non troppo, his Italian language book on populism. And I'll read to you a passage just to show you. The book was published in 2019, so Eve must have written it 2018. Over the last 4 years, the situation basically hasn't changed when it comes to the state of populism in Europe, at least. Evmeni. In Europa occidentale, l'impatto dei partiti populisti sulle istituzioni è stato a prima vista marginale. In nessun paese sono riusciti a imporre il loro punto di vista, spesso anche molto vago in materia costituzionale. And then many give some examples of the then important populist parties in Western Europe: Forza Italia, Lega, Movimento 5 Stelle, Podemos in Spagna, Front National in Francia. And then he goes on, and that's an important sentence. Tuttavia, i partiti populisti hanno messo a segno altri colpi, that is, other than these institutional ones. Hanno contribuito al fallimento della Costituzione europea. We know what happened to this idea. Sono riusciti a far passare l'idea che il referendum possa essere un metodo normale di governo e hanno profondamente modificato lo spirito delle istituzioni, soprattutto in Polonia e in Ungheria. So this is sort of spelling out, highlighting Poland and Hungary as the two states in which populism has affected institutions, and not just the spirit of institutions as elsewhere, is something that can be repeated today after the recent rounds of elections in these two countries. And just one other sentence when he continues about Hungary, he says this: in pochi anni, ad esempio, l'Ungheria è passata da un costituzionalismo alla tedesca, with a strong constitutional court, independent, etc., a un controllo di costituzionalità depotenziato e sotto la sorveglianza del potere politico. And this statement, which applies also to Poland, can be repeated today. While various populist movements in other West European countries, or in other European countries, say the movement which brought about Brexit in the UK, or populist parties in Italy, or Front National, which never came to power but is very clear, they had importantly affected the public discourse and spirit in these two countries, in Poland and Hungary. They managed to importantly dismantle democratic institutions, including Corte Costituzionale, which Yves mentions specifically. And that became consolidated, strengthened, petrified through the recent rounds of elections. So that is, and this consolidation, as I suggest in one of these points on this slide, has some very important consequences within both these countries, Poland and Hungary. So it may be some sort of memento for other countries about what happens if you re-elect populists to power. The old democratic constitutional memories fade away. The institutions and people in them get used to those non-democratic norms. The opposition becomes demoralized, and by and large, people learn to live with the democratically defective government. Okay, that's the first set of issues which warrants topicality of the theme of my lecture. The second is, of course, COVID. We have had this worldwide tragedy of which we are only now starting to emerge. And obviously, an important question that political scientists have to ask and do ask themselves is, how did the different political regimes handle COVID? Because it is sort of like a stress test for a political system. And can we already draw some conclusions about the relative capacity of populist governments in dealing with COVID, which is a sort of challenge to the system similar to a war, right? And I think that we can draw already some working hypotheses about it, and I'll be talking about it this Thursday. And of course, the most dramatic issue which we face in Europe today is the war in Ukraine, is the invasion. I mean, people sometimes talk about war between Russia and Ukraine, which is a way of trivializing the horror of the invasion, because it's an invasion, it's an aggression, unwarranted aggression of Russia against Putin's Russia against Ukraine. And one way, of course, the war has different dimensions, but one way of thinking about that war is to think about it as just one other episode in an ongoing competition between democracies and totalitarian regimes, or non-democratic regimes, or autocratic regimes. How do we call them? This will be one of the topics I'll be discussing later. But at least here we have, and that type of interpretation of Russia's invasion on Ukraine as a form of, as a way of competition between autocracy and a democratic system, has been spelled out by President Joe Biden in his speech in Warsaw, the first big speech after the war in March this year, where he basically conceptualized the war in these exact terms. So I think this adds an extra validity to the topicality of our theme. Now, let me say a few words about characteristics of populism, the way I understand it. So what I'm interested in are populist regimes in countries such as Hungary and Poland, no surprise to you, India, under Narendra Modi, the Philippines under Duterte, who lost power, and we don't know how young Marcos will continue his legacy or not. Brazil, until just a few weeks ago, when Bolsonaro lost power to Lula. I mean, Bolsonaro is one of those, if you like, typical populist rulers. And Venezuela, but not anymore, not under Maduro, where it is clearly an oppressive government, but under Chavez, his predecessor. These are just some exemplars of authoritarian populism, which I'll be discussing in my lectures. So we can define it negatively, and then a little bit more ambitiously, we can define it positively. So the negative definition is by what authoritarian populism is not. So it can be defined as something which is between consolidated democracy and an all-out, fully fledged authoritarianism. It's somewhere in between. It is no longer a consolidated democracy because it lacks some fundamental features of democracy, and in particular, a genuine division of powers and the rule of law. But it's also not an all-out, a sort of fully fledged authoritarianism. For two reasons, at least. Because it emerges from genuine elections, and because the degree of oppression and violence by government is relatively low. Okay? So these are these sort of countries, these states, which are halfway between a really good consolidated democracy and, complete coercion, like North Korea, for instance, or Belarus, or now Russia. These are sort of negative descriptions. This is what authoritarian populism, which I'm talking about, is not. But now let's try to be more constructive in our definition. And let me suggest some, not all, it won't be exhaustive, but some of the main characteristics of this authoritarian populism I'll be talking about. And I will just draw them very superficially, almost sort of impressionistically, because I'll be developing some of these themes in more detail in my lectures. So the most important on the sort of like positive side about these countries is that we are talking about the states in which elections are free and relatively fair. In other words, these are the elections in which the rulers can lose power. Okay? if a country moved beyond that point, and in which there is no way that the rulers can lose, I won't be calling them populist authoritarian or authoritarian populism. Okay? I'll be talking about them as simply despotic or autocratic governments. So theoretically, people such as Kaczynski in my home country, Poland, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Narendra Modi in India, may lose power. Or Donald Trump, who did lose power, right? So these are countries which maintain a degree of fairness of election. Now, it is a very relative statement, because I say that the elections are more or less fair, by which I mean that usually the rulers, as soon as they come to power through completely fair and free elections, they start manipulating with the system, including with the electoral system, in a way as to tilt the playing field, to improve their chances of re-election. But if it is likely, it's possible for the opposition to win, it is still a populist authoritarian government, because this possibility of the loss by populists greatly informs the whole politics of the government. They do their best to win the next election, because they cannot take it for granted that they will win. Okay? Now, that means also that the elections, while still genuine and real, so they are not sham elections. They are not elections like in Russia, where, okay, there are elections, people go to vote, but we know no one else but Putin may win. Okay, so these are not real, genuine elections. These elections in populist countries lose their character of being largely oriented towards programs. That is, they are no longer what political scientists call programmatic election campaigns, but they are more like a referendum about the leader. They are more of a plebiscite in favor or against the leader. And therefore, this sort of programmatic aspect of elections is largely eroded. And they are, my colleague from NYU and a constitutional scholar who has greatly influenced my thinking, Professor Samuel Zakharov, says that in populist countries, elections are, quote unquote, existential rather than programmatic. Well, they are existential because it is a matter of life or death for the populists. If they lose, they will lose not only huge fortunes and high positions, but often their liberty, because they will go to jail for all the misdeeds that they had done while in power. So, and for the opposition, it is also an all or nothing situation, because each next lost election of the democratic opposition means the steady decline of chances of winning the election in future, because they know that the rulers will keep manipulating the electoral system. And how they manipulate, I'll talk about it tomorrow a bit, giving you a case study of Hungary. So electoral pedigree, electoral mandate is an important aspect of populist authoritarianism in the sense in which I'm using the word here. The next one is that political power is very highly personalized, usually in a charismatic leader. So, we often, when we talk about populist governments, we use the name of the leader rather than just the country. So we talk about Bolsonaro's Brazil, or Modi's India, or Orban's Hungary, because an individual plays such a crucial, fundamental role. So again, the notion of charismatic leadership in political science is a relatively technical notion, which does not necessarily correspond to our conventional idea of charisma. I mean, charismatic leader as leader who is a fantastic speaker, eloquent, funny, who attracts attention of people. No, these people may be relatively mediocre, like the leader in Poland, Kaczynski. He's no charismatic in a sense in which you think about charisma of a leader. And yet what is quote unquote charismatic about those personalities is that one cannot really think about the system without this one particular person. And we have a sense that if he, or occasionally she, think about Evita Peron, right, dies, the system will sort of collapse. His acolytes, his supporters will have a big problem because so much hinges upon this one person. He has more or less eliminated any other personal alternative for leadership in government. The third characteristic of these systems that I'll be talking about is that they have greatly eroded separation of powers. I mean, the lack of separation of powers for me is one of the defining features of this authoritarian populism, in the sense that we have a notion whether whatever system of separation of powers you have, whether it's more American type of checks and balancings, or it's more traditional, say, French idea going back to Montesquieu of this tripartite separation of powers, where the different powers are kept apart or mutually balance each other, etc. What matters is that power is dispersed. So dispersion of power is perhaps slightly better notion than separation of powers, but also sort of less technical. What matters is really the negative. The fact that it is not the case that the entire political power is concentrated in one hand. We already know that if all powers becomes too concentrated in one hand, this is bad news. Okay? This must lead to abuse of power, because even if these one hands belong to a real genius and someone who knows everything and who wishes his people the best, we know that this sooner or later will degenerate into oppression. And so even though those countries which I had listed before as my exemplars of authoritarian populism have constitutional principles of separation of powers, they really don't matter. Because we know that whatever matters in countries such as Hungary or Poland, at the end of the day will depend on the decision of Orban or of Kaczynski. And if they don't decide about something, it is only because they had delegated it to some of them, of their trusted collaborators. And they can withdraw this delegation at any time they wish. The next aspect on which I'll be talking at some length tomorrow, so let me just mention it very briefly, is about an attitude of populist authoritarians to institutions. So the way in which populist authoritarians differ, say, from Bolsheviks, from Lenin, and then Stalin, is that they do not abolish the institutions which they had inherited from their predecessors. They more or less stay within the inherited institutional system. There are some exceptions to it. Chavez in Venezuela more or less abolished the traditional institutions, but none of the other leaders I had mentioned here had abolished the institutional system. So the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland is exactly as it was under the democratic governments up to 2015, or the electoral commissions, or Supreme Courts, etc. So on one hand, they do respect the institutional shape of their countries. That's sadly the case also of Modi, of Duterte in the Philippines, of Bolsonaro. But they erode those institutions of their original meaning. And we sometimes use the metaphor of hollowing out. There are the institutions, they are being hollowed out. They are like empty shell. They no longer contain all those meanings and functions, and most importantly, people whom they had before populist authoritarians came to power. And I will present a little bit more, well, much more detailed account, because I'm a constitutional lawyer, I'm interested in institutions. What do they do to institutions within which they work? And the final, and only the final point, is that populist authoritarians use certain types of dominant narratives, certain language, certain stories, certain discourse, which is quite characteristic. I mean, one of the most characteristic aspects is that almost all of them use some forms of conspiracy theories. They largely base their legitimacy on an allegedly successful fight against alleged conspiracies. Whether these are Marxists, as in Bolsonaro's story, or George Soros, as in Orban's story, or Russians and previous government which plotted to arrange or to bring about an airplane fall containing previous president in Poland, etc. There is always some conspiracy. And this conspiratorial thinking is inherent to populists because of their fundamental anti-elitist narrative. They come to power, and again, we'll talk about it even today, a little bit later, about how populists successfully promote their story about countering the existing elites. And conspiracy theory is this anti-elitist narrative pushed to the extreme, usually to absurd extreme, but also an extreme which is often very popular, very attractive to many people, for reasons which I will describe in some detail in the third day of these lectures, when I will be talking about those conspiracy theories and about various ways in which populist discourse is so unique. And for many people, it's just plain stupid, but it works. And if it works, then, cynical politicians do not abstain from using it. Let me just add one extra point, which is not a characteristic of populism, but which sort of defines those authoritarian populist governments which I am discussing, which I'm interested in. And that is that I'm interested only in those populist governments which can be described by a particular trajectory, that is, which mark certain decline of standards already achieved. So I'm interested in the countries which already had sometimes very long and successful episode or period of a reasonably good democracy, with also good separation of powers and the rule of law. And then something happened, and populists came to power, and it declined. So I'm not interested in those countries where we are not talking about backsliding because they have been always in the same place, which can be more described as being certain plateau. I mean, Russia never, even under Yeltsin, hasn't really achieved any workable democracy before, nor has China. So I'm not talking about these countries. I'm talking about the countries which noted a decline from the already achieved level. So here I give some statistic or some, if you like, rankings from Freedom House ranking, and list those countries which I had just mentioned: Poland, Hungary, Brazil, India, Philippines, and Venezuela. And I show the way in which they diminished in the rankings of their democracy compared to the pre-populist period. So, for example, in Poland, Freedom House gave Poland 2 out of 4, where 1 is the best, 4 is the worst. 5 is the worst. Well, in the first elections after populists came to power, they declined to rank number 4, etc. And I think that it is important to think about backsliding, to think about trajectory. The trajectories do matter, actually. And again, this is something I will be describing in some detail later. So let me just mention one other thing, and that is about my approach to populism in, if you like, against the background of the contemporary academic literature on populism. And for simplicity, I would distinguish between 2 main approaches: the dominant, which I call quote-unquote discursive approach, and the more or less non-conventional or minoritarian approach, which I'll call institutional approach. So much of the writings about populism today is influenced by a very important scholar, American scholar of German origins, and let me engage again in this name dropping, and a very good friend of mine, Jan Werner Müller, whose little book, What is Populism?, marked a certain turnaround in contemporary thinking about populism. But he's not the only one. There are many others, perhaps much more sophisticated and interesting, but don't mention that to Jan Werner, you know that you've heard it from me, because he won't like it, is Nadia Urbinati, an Italian political theorist currently at Columbia University in New York. So Müller, Urbinati, and many other people define populism by a sort of discourse that populists use. And this is, to put it most briefly in one word, anti-pluralist discourse. So Jan Werner Müller says, well, you can tell that you are dealing with a populist if you listen to a certain language. And this language is, we represent the entire people. So it's anti-pluralist. It rejects an idea that democracy is composed of a variety of groups with different ideologies, interests, and identities, and that it is a good thing too. Okay, this is the fundamental, if you like, liberal democratic tradition going back to great scholar, great philosophers such as Bentham or John Stuart Mill. You know that the diversity in the society is a good thing, and it's an inherent. This pluralism is an inherent part of any democracy, and we shouldn't regret it. Okay? But populists the way they are understood by Urbinati and Müller, reject it. They say, no, we know what is the true interest of the people, and we represent the entire people. And those who disagree with us, they don't count. They are somehow either mistaken or they are part of a conspiracy against democracy. You know, they should be more or less eliminated, not necessarily physically, but politically speaking, they should be disregarded, sidelined, and eliminated. So if you like, it is a certain discourse of a pars pro toto, part representing the totality. And everything else in this strand of thinking and writing about populism follows from this pars pro toto, from this usurpation of legitimacy of representing the entire people, even though in fact you only represent one part of the people or one of a number of possible views. And from what I had already said before, when I defined authoritarian populism the way I understand it, you may realize that I do not see myself, do not endorse, if you like, that approach. I am much more interested in institutional effects of populists' actions. That's because I'm interested more in what populists do rather than what they say. And in my view, this discourse-oriented approach to populism is funnily enough at the same time under-inclusive and over-inclusive. It is under-inclusive because there are some populists who do not use that type of language, and they are still populists under my definition, okay? For example, usually Kaczynski in Poland, someone I know well, both personally and also as an object of my research and occasionally of my anger, doesn't use that type of anti-pluralist language often. And yet he is a par excellence populist leader. So, and it is sort of under-inclusive because there are some perfectly democratic leaders who, especially in the heat of the election campaign, use this type of language. Yes, we know what is good for the entire people. We have identified based the common good. We are not just representing, I don't know, the farmers or city dwellers or Christians or Jews or secular people. We have managed to identify a certain common good. In fact, if a democratic politician doesn't say that, then probably she or he is a bad politician and unlikely to win. Okay? So, hinging our definition of populism on what they say, on the language, is particularly unreliable, unstable. But I think in the end, so that is why I believe that these discursive definitions are not particularly helpful for a precise study of populism. But I think that ultimately, the difference between institutionalists, such as me or Issacharoff, whom I mentioned, and on the other hand, discourse-oriented theorists, such as Müller and Urbinati, are based on two different reasons or two sources. One is those who are interested in discourse are usually political theorists or political scientists. Political theorists are interested in stories that are being told by the power. Okay? Then listen to them. While the institutionalists are usually lawyers, especially constitutional lawyers. We are not all that much excited by what Trump or Kaczynski or Orban say. We look what they actually do to institutions. So we have simply different, if you like, research mission, different focus of our research. But there is a second source of this difference, and that is that people like me or like Zakharov are interested really in populists in government, when populists rule. So, these countries which I had mentioned, and you can, of course, add to it Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, these are countries in which populists came to power, in which we can actually test what they said before by their actions. But of course, there is plenty of research about populism, which is not about populists in power, but populists as a movement, as an ideology, before they come to power. What did Giorgia Meloni say before she won the election, in which she could say anything, because it was never tested by her action? What Madame Le Pen says in France, because she never actually held power. There is a lot of research on populism as a movement before it actually gains power. But for us, for constitutional lawyers, it's not particularly interesting, because they can say anything, and there is no verification of what they actually mean in practice. We are much more interested in those, according to us, sorry situations in which populists have grabbed power and are able actually to affect the institutional and particularly constitutional system to suit their ideology. I think that it may be a right time now to take a break, but before I suggest a break, let me just say that at any point I'm very happy to take any questions from you, or any comments for that matter. These don't have to be questions. You may have a view, you may express your comment. I'll be very, very interested in hearing you. And I'm very happy to take your points made either in English or in Italian, any way you prefer. So I understand Italian, so you can use your native language if that is your language, whichever you prefer. So how about Benedetta? What do you think? Shall we take 15 minutes break now?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So how about if we take 15 minutes break, pause, and meet at 11?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Briefly, to just say a couple of words of welcome to Professor Sadurski on behalf of the University of Macerata. I'm John McCourt, the new Rettore of this university, and it's a great honor and a privilege to have such an important international guest to give the Alberico Gentili lectures this year, following in a very rich and wonderful tradition of lectures which have been held over the last 10 years or so by some of the world's most influential thinkers in the area of justice and politics and so on. And I was just looking through the publications that have derived from these lectures, and we see some extremely important names, Italian and international, and we're delighted to have Wojciech Sadurski join this list, and we look forward to seeing these lectures in this form with Il Mulino, which will be published in the near future. Obviously, the theme is extremely central: a populist challenge to democracy, and all we have to do is look around at the difficulties that all of our democracies are facing, and how absurd it is that it's with a sense of relief that we look to the United States and see that democracy held again in the midterm elections, where most of the election result deniers seem to have been defeated in that particular jurisdiction. But it's not only to the United States that we have to look, as I'm sure Professor Sadurski has been showing you and will show you over the course of his lectures. As you know, he is a distinguished professor of constitutional law, who is also very well acclimatized with Italy and the Italian situation, having worked for many years at the European University Institute in Florence. And currently he teaches at the University of Sydney. So we're extremely grateful to him for the time that he has dedicated to coming and staying in this city of Macerata, and in continuing this wonderful tradition of these lectures, which we're certainly going to continue into the future. I just want to take this opportunity to, in thanking Professor Sadurski, to present him with a couple of items from the university. The first is you can never come to Macerata and not leave without one of these for your water. There you are. So much. You take that with you. And perhaps this is more significant. This is the Cartografia di Matteo Ricci. And of course, we are in the city of Matteo Ricci. And this was edited by one of our emeritus professors, Filippo Mignini, from the Department of Humanities, and published by the Istituto Poligrafico e Zecca dello Stato. So I'd like to present you this on behalf of the university. Thank you very much. And finally, and I hope you have more than hand luggage when you're traveling back to Sydney, because otherwise you're going to have to book in another bag. These are the volumes that have been published from the Alberico Gentili lectures. So we'd like to present you with these as well. Very much. Okay, so can we just give him a round of applause and express our thanks as he starts the second session.
Well, thank you very much, Rector Magnificus. First of all, let me congratulate you on the elections, because I suppose you are still in this period of euphoria or amazement about what it means to be a rector of a great historical Italian university in this beautiful town of Macerata. Thank you very much for all these gifts. I can see now I have something to read in this long flight back to Sydney. But I guess now that I have received my gifts, I can go home, and I don't need to keep you here listening to me. But I won't do that. Okay. So thank you once again. Thank you very much. Let me move to the second part of my today's presentation. But again, let me remind you, you are very welcome to signal to me your willingness to ask a question or make a point. And in any event, I had just agreed with Professor Barbizon that we will aim at ending my presentation perhaps around 12 o'clock, after which we will have plenty of time for Q&A. So let me move on in my presentation. And I had already alluded in my general outline for these lectures to the point which I would like to insist very strongly on, and that is that there is no single populism. Rather, that there are different populisms in plural. But as you see, I'm using a motto for this part of my lectures, a motto which is probably the most famous first sentence of a novel ever written, or at least judged by how often it is being quoted, sometimes correctly, sometimes with wrong motives. But this first sentence of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, everyone knows, whether you went on and read the book, but I recommend you do because the book is beautiful. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I will paraphrase this sentence to talk about democracies. And I will convert it into a sentence: all good democracies are alike. Every defective democracy is defective in its own way. Now, of course, there's a little bit of exaggeration in it, and every political scientist will immediately protest. No, it's not the case that every good, consolidated, well-functioning, well-ordered democracy is the same. We have plenty of different democracies. We have presidential and parliamentary. We have republican and monarchies. We have federal and unitary. We have the established church and laicite, etc., etc. So there are plenty of dimensions in which even really good democracies differ from each other. And yet there are certain fundamentals which are absolutely intrinsic to the very nature of democracy, and within which we cannot really talk about well-ordered democracy. And there are these four characteristics which I list here. First of all, free and fair elections. And of course, the government emerging from fair elections. Government corresponding to the majority will as expressed in free and fair elections. This is, in a sense, a defining characteristic of any democracy. And you cannot have a democracy without free and fair election, and the majority rule which corresponds to it. Tomorrow I'll be talking a little bit more about majority rule, because I had the pleasure of contributing my chapter to a wonderful book co-edited by Professor Barbizan and Giuliana Mato and Professor Cesare Pinelli.
Yes.
Where I devoted a chapter on populism and majority rule, so it will match my tomorrow's lecture. But of course, free and fair election, while it is perhaps defining feature of democracy, is not all that matters, because free and fair elections, if, for instance, there is no freedom of speech, freedom of associations, freedom of assembly in the time preceding elections, then these elections are meaningless. Okay, we can still go and elect and choose between different parties, but if some parties cannot make their views known, what sort of democracy are we talking about? So there are certain civil and political rights which are instrumental to free and fair election. And now lawyers and constitutional theorists will disagree about how far these rights, which are sort of instrumental for free and fair elections, go. Obviously, freedom of speech, at least freedom of political speech, freedom of political parties, freedom of assembly and demonstrations, at least on political issues. And then one may disagree. What about freedom of religion? Is it instrumental to the electoral choice? Probably it is, because part of the agenda may be on the relationship between state and churches, and maybe sort of matters which are religiously significant. So even if we disagree about the outer boundaries, Nevertheless, some degree of core civil and political rights are absolutely essential for democracy. Then there is a matter of dispersion of powers. And for reasons I had already mentioned before the break, I prefer to talk about dispersion of power rather than separation of powers, because separation of powers has a sort of more technical meaning in constitutional language. And the American style of checks and balances usually is not considered to be separation of powers, because in fact powers in the American constitutions are not separated. If anything, they are almost merged with each other, but they are split in a way in which no single institution may monopolize the power over anything. So really what matters in the dispersion of powers is that this negative approach, it is not the case that one person or one institution can decide anything, everything. And we know, maybe it's not a defining or conceptual necessity, but it's more empirical necessity, empirical wisdom of the last 2 centuries. We know that a monopower, that a power concentrated in one person must end up in oppression. You cannot have democracy without dispersion of power. And finally, the last point is the rule of law. Again, I won't be going, it's of course a contested and difficult concept, but I'll be using the rule of law for these purposes in an extremely simplistic and superficial, but I think meaningful sense. That is, it is the case that the current ruling power cannot change the law as it likes at any step of the way, but it must conform its conduct to the legal framework. So, okay, if you are a prime minister or president or minister of something, you cannot, you see that within the given legal system, you cannot achieve your political means, you change the law. And now it becomes legal, what you wanted to do. So it's more what, we lawyers sometimes distinguish between rule by law and rule of law. And I really mean a rule of law, whereby legal framework, especially constitutional framework, is to some extent entrenched against day-to-day wishes of current political elite. Of course, it is more a matter of degree rather than black and white distinction, because no law is or should be unchangeable. No law is set in stone. And yet we should be thinking about law as creating rules of the game. And of course, if you are playing a game, you cannot change the rules as you go. Okay? So there is that degree of entrenchment. And I think that these 4 aspects are reasonably non-controversial, so that we do not need to go into any fine details of different theories of democracies, so that someone will say, well, is it really democratic? But what democracy do you have in mind? What adjective do you add to it? Will you add to it liberal or populist or direct or indirect or deliberative or this or that? I think that these 4 characteristics are intrinsic to democracy as such, so that you cannot have a democratic system without a degree of achievement in each of these 4 characteristics. So if that's the case, if we have this 4-tier definition, very simple, minimalistic definition of democracy, then under this characterization of populist authoritarian systems, which I had outlined in the first hour, you can see that populisms are defective in at least 2 ways. They do not respect dispersion of power, just to the contrary. Power is highly centralized and personalized in a leader who can decide anything. And if he doesn't decide something, then it is merely a matter of his will of delegation to someone. And secondly, they do not observe the rule of law. And we'll be talking about it in big detail tomorrow, about what populists do with and to law. So populism is missing under this democratic template or democratic checklist in at least two important ways, from the point of view of dispersion of power and from the point of view of the rule of law. With civil and political rights, it depends. By and large, civil and political rights are largely respected, complied with, perhaps is a better word, by the populist systems which I describe here. And that distinguishes them from oppressive systems such as, I don't know, in Syria under Assad or in North Korea under Kim. So that the use of legal persecution, I always, as so many non-English speakers, I always confuse persecution and prosecution, but I have in mind persecution this time. So the level of legal persecution is relatively low. It is there, and it's quite discriminatory. It's used against the opponents, but usually is by soft ways, like, from what Professor Barbizan mentioned in her kind introduction to me. I had some problems with the Polish government, and they threw books at me, they threw defamation cases at me, but, big deal, defamation case. It's not like, the hundreds of prisoners in jail. When there are hundreds of prisoners in jail, as is the case of Turkey, I don't really consider it to be a populist government. They have already crossed that line. And there are free and fair elections, because again, it's one of the defining features. Freedom is there. People are not compelled in the way they should vote or should abstain from voting, and they are relatively fair. Again, we'll be talking about elections tomorrow. They are relatively fair. Okay, the playing field is tilted against the opponents of the regime and in favor of the incumbents, but it's not the case that the opposition cannot win. So back to pluralism, to populism in plural. I believe that we should resist a temptation of thinking about current wave of populism in the way in which, say, we talk about a pandemic. Pandemic is one and the same, because it's caused by one and the same virus, whether it's in Uganda or in the United States. But when we talk about a wave of populism or a trend of populism, etc., there is an unfortunate temptation to think about it as some sort of impersonal force which is going through the world and which keeps colonizing one nation after the other. I really insist on talking about populisms with an S at the end in plural for the following reason. Populism is always an answer to real problems, not to convoluted artificial problems, to real problems, real anxieties and real issues. But real issues are local, not universal. There are different real issues in Venezuela than in the Philippines, than in India, than in Hungary. And all these different populisms are defined by the sort of sources of populism. And while the answers that populists give are, I believe strongly, fundamentally mistaken, wrong, and dangerous, the problems are real. The problems are not fictitious. Okay? And so we need to look at different configurations in which those different issues which trigger populist answers occur in different countries. And my sort of pseudoscientific suggestion is populist leaders are successful when they convince a large part of the electorate that they have solutions to more than one of different parts of the agenda, of different anxieties, things which make people worried. Okay? So they produce very simple, easy answers, but to multiple questions. And when they manage to bundle them together and say, yeah, I have an answer, enough of immigration or whatever, then they are likely to be successful. Now, that means that a real task to any scholar, any student of populism, is to try to identify what is a particular configuration of the sources of populism in a given country that she studies, okay? So that we shouldn't be thinking that the reasons why people tend to vote for Giorgia Meloni are exactly the same reasons which make people vote for Viktor Orban, or which Brazilians may vote for Bolsonaro. They are different, but they are multiple. And the number of those issues, while there may be large number of this populist agenda, let's call it, or factors of populism, is not infinite. So for certain simplicity, I will suggest now a list of those, what I call factors of populism, of typical, salient, important concerns that people have, which occasionally end up producing populist governments. Because the majority of people, or at least a large plurality of voters, tend to be attracted to populist answers. And once we have this taxonomy, if you like, of factors of populism, we can then look at any particular country and we'll end up with different configuration for each different country in order to understand, but why that populist managed to win the elections. So here are those, and again, this is probably not an exhaustive list, but I think it's close to comprehensive list of the factors. I think I've listed 5 such factors. So first is what is often called status anxiety. And you may be asking yourself, why did I put a picture of this fashion store in the suburb of Sydney called Newtown, where I live? And it's because I just realized that there is a shop called Status Anxiety. So it's a silly sort of trick on my part to attract your attention, but nothing really hinges on it. But plenty hinges on the second photo, which is a cover of a fantastic book, which I would recommend to everyone, and which really gives you one good insight into sources of populism, at least in the United States. It's a very famous book by a sociologist from Berkeley, Arlie Russell Hochschild, called Strangers in Their Own Land. And it was a big bestseller. And I understand that Professor Hochschild is now writing a sequel to that book. Now, she is a Berkeley sociologist. So as every Berkeley sociologist, she's a left-wing, sort of liberal in the American sense scholar. And she was very much interested in finding out why populations in some of the most disadvantaged parts of the United States, that is, those parts which are particularly badly done by policies of neoliberals, conservatives, etc., why they consistently vote for the extreme right wing. Before it was the Tea Party, then Trump emerged. Why do they sort of vote against what may be seen their self-interest, whereby the self-interest of people, all those badly educated, very underpaid, and incredibly environmentally disadvantaged people in Louisiana and Mississippi, why do they consistently vote for politicians, the policies of whom will even further contribute to their disadvantage. And in the course of her book, she has this striking metaphor, imagery, which she calls waiting in line. And she says, well, these are these people. Usually these are male, non-college educated, white, blue-collar workers in these areas who feel that they are waiting in line for a better life, for more affluence for them, for better chances and status for their kids. And that the American dream, which always said, your kids will have it better than you had, and their kids will have better than their parents, that there is this steady progress. They see that's not the case. And she says, because they feel themselves, we are waiting in line. And we are almost there, but then the government dispenses the benefits which we hoped for to some other people. This may be to women in the form of some affirmative action based on gender. This may be to non-white minorities, again, affirmative action. This may be immigrants who will get something from the government. And we are left aside. We are left behind. The government never gives us anything. You know, I have a friend and colleague in Sydney Law School who actually is very close to me because he also works in jurisprudence. His name is Michael Savelle. And like, again, people of his type of education, comes from very good colleges, etc. He's a left liberal, white left liberal. But he was born in Louisiana, near this exactly area where Professor Hochschild did her interviews and study the situation. And he told me, and his parents are fisher men, they are in the fishing industry. And he says, we never, ever has got anything from the government. And so these people naturally tend to gravitate towards identity-based ideas rather than some sort of economic rationality argument about whom to vote for. And things which are important are God, are guns, you know, and your race. Okay, so the status anxiety related to this fear of economic decline is converted into resentment, which acquires the language of precisely those values. Okay, religious values, identity, including racial or skin color identity, and this typically Southern American love of guns. And that is what, that type of anxiety which has a form of threat to our life, economically speaking, and to our status, feeds support for populists who come and say that, well, we have an answer to your problems, like Trump had a sort of answer to what they saw their problems were. The second factor of populism is xenophobia, understood as dislike, hatred, prejudice against others, against external others, in particular migrants, and often internal others, for example, LGBT minority. Those at least who are defined as being different from the traditional mainstream identity of a population. So here you see the photo taken at the Polish-Belarus border against migrants, would-be migrants from Middle East and Northern Africa who managed to get, and Afghanistan lately, who managed to get to Belarus in order to immigrate to European Union via Poland to Germany. You know, so there has been this great sense of hatred to those most disadvantaged of all disadvantaged people in the world. And it somehow didn't go very well with the traditional Christian self-identity or self-perception of Poles. But of course, this anti-migrant animus, which is largely based on racism and on religious bigotry, is not characteristic to Poland only. Okay? So there is the sense that these people pose a threat not just to our economy, to our jobs, but also to our way of life. And this anti-immigrant animus, for instance, in Poland, there has been some very good sociological studies about it, and there was one in particular which showed by Professor Maciej Gdula, who is now also a member of parliament of one of the left-wing parties, and he did interviews with people about why they are so much against migrants. Well, there are no, and it was before Putin's invasion against Ukraine, which really produced huge amount of migrants. We are talking about pre-24 February this year situation. And he said, well, to many people, this hatred to others, this possibility of being able to say no to their pleas for entry is one way of compensating for their real individual failures in job, in education, in family, and so on and so on. That to many people, their sense of self-respect is somehow perversely based on this power, which is a negative power of saying no, of being able to see and to make sure that there are some people who are in even worse situation. And then we have the next factor, which is the most universal, although not necessarily in the sense that it exists in every populist state, and that is this anti-elite approach. And here I would like to read to you, first in my bad French, but then I'll translate a piece from UniMc, whom I had already mentioned before, my great predecessor in these Gentili lectures, in a book which he tells me will be published now in your series, yeah. But he first published it in French, Sur la légitimité, about legitimacy. And he says this, excuse my French, as they say. Les partis ou mouvements hors système introduisent une nouvelle vision de la politique démocratique en contestant les rôles des élites, accusées d'indifférence à l'égard du peuple, d'incompétence et souvent de corruption. Les mandants trahissent leurs mandataires. Il faut donc les mettre à la porte et les remplacer non par de nouvelles élites, mais par le peuple. It cannot be said better. So he says this, parties or movements which are outside the system introduce a new vision of democratic politics by contesting the role of elites, which are being accused of indifference towards the people, of incompetence, and often of corruption. And by the way, let me just make a digression. Very often those accusations are correct, of course. So that, you know, the fact that populists are anti-elites doesn't mean that elites are beyond reproach. Let me continue from Meny. Those who have a mandate betray those who gave them this mandate. So it is necessary to push them out and to replace them not by new elites, but by the people. And that is this sense of we are outside the elite and we are against the elite is usually one of the main motivating forces in the attractiveness of populists. And you know, when you come to think of it, there is an incredible hypocrisy in it, because some of the most paradigmatic populists were very much part of the elite. Donald Trump, not being part of an elite, give me a break. Silvio Berlusconi, Jarosław Kaczynski, who has been in the Polish establishment since 1989 continuously, you know. So, but they managed to present themselves as being actually outsiders who are moved against the elite. And as Nadia Urbinati, whom I had mentioned here before, says, it is very important that when populists use this anti-elite language, they don't talk about economic elites, administrative elites, military elites, and many other elites, which sort of are often source of populist career, only about political elites. Okay? So they are against political elites. And much of their success relies on successful presenting themselves as being outsiders, as being with the people, as being sort of disadvantaged and discriminated against. And often it leads to the situation that they are already part of the government, very much part of the government. They may be president of the United States, and they go around the land and they say, look, we are against the government. You know, we have to drain in Washington, etc. And you see it, you know, this attempt of parading as at the same time being the government and also being anti-government, anti-elite is part of the success of their discourse. Okay. The next important factor of populism, but not everywhere again, is anti-globalism. And here a story is very well recognizable. You know, they take our jobs, they being, you know, under a liberal free trade, globalized economy, the jobs gravitate to countries with cheap labor and skilled labor at the same time, like India, China, Vietnam, Brazil, Indonesia, etc. So globalism and lack of protectionism means that the jobs go there, while what we get are those incredibly cheap products coming from China, India, Bangladesh, etc., which obviously erode the competitive force of our own industries. So this is like a vicious circle. You know, we are losing the jobs and we are losing our industries in the globalized world. And the reason for it is that this global stratification, global division between the rich north and the south and the poor south is sort of replicated also in rich north. That is in countries like the United States or Western Europe, where globalization has a disparate impact on different strata of society. So there are some people who are actually net losers of globalization, even if globalization brings about more, sort of statistically speaking, economic growth or growth in affluence in the society. But this growth is not the same to all. It is actually quite discriminatory. And one of the greatest economists today, Derek, I think, Roderick of Harvard University, writes a lot about how globalization has this disparate impact. So now when you have that situation, there are some strata and some groups in your society which are net disadvantaged by globalization, then theoretically there are two possibilities of response to it. One would be a traditional left-wing socialist approach, and that is, okay, so let's now redistribute internally the benefits of globalization through more public goods, through redistributive taxation, through some wise regional policy, because some regions simply are more disadvantaged by it, etc. But you have also right-wing reaction to it, which is more protectionism. Let's close the borders again. Okay? And let us address our anger not against sources of globalization, but against those people, those Chinese or Indian or Brazilian or Indonesian workers who benefit, again, in a statistical sense, from globalized economy. And somehow it so happens that this latter response, the right-wing response, has replaced the traditional demand for left-wing, social democratic, labor parties in the West. And the reason may be something which has been noted by many political scientists, that with the globalization, we have seen the end of a certain, at least in Europe, but also in the United States, of a certain post-Second World War consensus. Consensus about capitalism and democracy. Consensus under which the labor agreed to limit its sort of like class war and contestation of capitalism, but the business and the capital agreed to a degree of redistribution and also to respect to strong trade unions. Now we see that none of that remains, and therefore populists enter into that void. And finally, fifth factor in my list is what I call, in a very, very sort of general and not particularly precise way, anti-modernism. But this anti-modernism may be split into anti-enlightenment, anti-secularism, anti all these sort of quote-unquote novelties, such as gender equality, such as fight with the family violence, such as, most importantly perhaps, recognition and tolerance for or recognition of rights of LGBT, etc. All these things which are being seen as challenge to the traditional patterns of authority with which people sort of become comfortable. Many people, of course not everyone, but many people. And they just fear that these movements, also ecology, which is seen some sort of, luxury or some, invention of very rich people who have nothing worse to worry about. So, and this is something that, for example, in Poland, I can see as perhaps being the dominant movement, this type of, and maybe it has to do something with not just the force of religion in the society, but also with the institutional power of the dominant religious group, that is Roman Catholic Church, in its most bigoted version in the world, which we now happen to have in Poland. But I hope that you have more or less a picture of what I mean by this anti-modernism. So now, putting all this together, if you see, I have this list, I've put this list, this checklist, if you like, of different factors of populism in this slide: status anxiety, xenophobia, anti-elite, anti-globalization, anti-modernism. And as a sort of like trick, again, to attract your attention, I would like to use a metaphor of Lego toys. Okay? So Lego toys may be created from different pieces. Okay? And different pieces will bring about different Lego toys. They are still Lego toys. Okay? And the number of those pieces that Lego produces is large, but not unlimited. And that's the way I'd like to think about contemporary populism, that it comes as a putting together, bundling, configuration of different factors, and these different factors taken on their own, do not necessarily stick to each other. For example, how about anti-elite and anti-immigrants? Elites are liberal, rich, usually white, at least in the societies of wealthy North, etc. people. Immigrants are the opposite of all that. They have nothing. They are in this situation of existential threat to their life every day. They usually have quote-unquote bad color and quote-unquote bad religion. That is the ones which are despised or feared by the majority of society to which they want to get. And yet there is a strange combination of being at the same time anti-immigrant and anti-elitist. Stephen Holmes, a political scientist from NYU Law School, has written a lot about it, how somehow in Europe, especially in response to the immigration crisis of 1915 and after, this strange, at first blush, ironic or paradoxical connection between at the same time being anti-elite and anti-immigrant came together. And it came together by some sort of idea, yeah, because these elites actually, they support the immigrants. You know, they want them, they want, you know, there is this idiotic conspiracy theory about grand remplacement, you know, that someone has a plan to replace good Christian population of Europe with Muslim migrants, right? And these are the elites, you know, these elites, these are people like ex-Chancellor Merkel, you know, with her welcome policy. You know, they do it all for the wrong reasons, but there is some strange collusion between an elite and immigrants. Okay, so we have these different Lego toys, and what I say is that an intelligent study of populism should try to identify a given country and find a country-specific configuration of different of these factors. So I can say from in my home country, like Poland, some of these factors are almost non-existent. Certainly anti-globalism has no particular, you know, no mileage in Poland. Just to the country, Poland is one of the most Euro-enthusiastic or EU-enthusiastic societies among member states of the EU. And sort of being pro-European is a sort of indication of this pro-globalist approach, at least in Europe, right? And even status anxiety in Poland is at a relatively low level because it normally coincides with economic crisis. Actually, Poland did very, very well after the 2008 and post European crisis. The only country in Europe which didn't note a negative growth. Okay, so one would say, well, from this sort of structural point of view, this is not a particularly fertile soil for populism. You know, populism, we imagine, arises when there is a sudden threat and crisis, but there was no economic crisis. But then you have other factors, and in particular, you have this anti-elite. When the current populist government came to power, it was after unprecedented 2 subsequent terms of office of the center-right liberal government. So there was the sense, well, this elite has become so entrenched that even the slightest corruption charges, often correct, often accurate, were magnified. And this elite, personified by Donald Tusk, an ex-president of the European Council, you know, became like the enemy, guilty of all the failures that individuals could have. And certainly anti-modernism, largely on religious grounds, which I had mentioned before. Let me, before I end this lecture and invite Q&A, let me make 2 additional points which goes sort of beyond this Lego toys story and beyond the variety of populisms in plural. One is about the importance of polarization. Now, one thing which has been established beyond any doubt is that there is a clear correlation between how polarized a society is and how likely it is to go populist. Put it in short, populists benefit from social polarization. But of course, polarization has to be defined. Not every pluralism, not any difference is polarization. Some people, like those VDEM analysts whom I had quoted, use the concept of toxic populism. I would say that, toxic polarization. Now, I would say that toxic polarization, the way I understand it, differs from good pluralism, which is also polarization. I mean, there are people who are socialists and conservatives, right? There are religious, not religious, etc. I mean, we are so different. And often it's a good thing too, but often it's not a good thing. So when does polarization become toxic? I would say it's when it acquires to a high degree 3 following characteristics. First, polarization becomes in public discourse moralized. That is, people who are different from me, who vote, say, for the party which I dislike, are not just mistaken. Of course, they are mistaken by definition, otherwise you would vote for the way they do. So if you disagree with their electoral choice, you believe that they are wrong. But in this toxic polarization, you start believing they are not just wrong, they are bad. They are evil. They are immoral. You despise them. And I myself realize when I get into introspection and think about at least some people in my home country who voted for law and justice, I do not just think that they are wrong. I have this temptation of thinking, but they are not just wrong, they are bad, you know? And of course, we should resist this temptation, but sometimes it's very difficult to resist it. Okay? So polarization, toxic polarization become highly moralized. Because you can discuss with a person who you think is wrong. You can convince her to your views. But what's the point of discussing with an evil person? You are not happy that that person is in your society. Doesn't mean that you want to annihilate them, but you'd rather have a society without bad people. Well, we want to have society with people who think differently than we are, because we all good liberals have learned from John Stuart Mill, you know, that we can also learn from mistakes of others. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing about this toxic polarization is that it is negative in the following sense, that my disapproval of others is stronger than my approval of my own people. In other words, if you are, say, a voter for whatever now is Partito Democratico, you dislike the leaders of Fratelli d'Italia or Cinque Stelle or whatever more than you actually respect your own leaders, the leaders you support. And that is something that many sociologists, political sociologists, realize in the United States until Trump, that Republicans hate Democrats more than they love Trump, and also vice versa. And that's a problem, okay? Because we tend to think in our ideal of democracy that we are motivated by supporting those for whom we vote, rather than by disliking those who would not get a benefit of our vote. But that's not the case. And finally, the third point, simplest perhaps, is that this toxic polarization is drastic in the sense that the society becomes divided into clusters which are distanced from each other, which are far away, and where the overlap is almost non-existent. So that in some 2-3 decades ago, the overlap between Democrats and Republicans in the United States was very high. You don't remember that because you are too young for that. But when you read, say, political history of the United States, you realize that sort of difference between Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, or Republican Party and Democratic Party, wasn't all that great. The distance was short and the overlap was high. But when the distance grows, these clusters separate, sort of travel in separate trajectories from each other and do not overlap, then this becomes a really toxic polarization. So there you go. You have polarization which is moralized, negative, and drastic, and that's when populist benefit from. And they actually actively contribute to it by various rhetorical tricks, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. And the final point I wanted to make is slightly more academic, perhaps. And that is that okay, so in political science, when people try to explain popularity of various movements, whether it's, studying popularity of socialists or fascists or populists or liberals, whatever, the usual approach is to look at the so-called demand factors. Think about supply and demand in economic terms. Okay? There is a demand which explains why there are such prices for certain rare goods, because there's a big demand for it. If there was low demand, the price would be low. Okay? And similar in political demand, there is a big demand. So we think, where does this demand come from? And we usually look at structural reasons, such as about globalization. Okay? These are matters of structure. But what I feel is underestimated in the studies of success of populism in recent years is the supply side. So market economy has supply and demand, and politics also has supply and demand. There's a demand for, say, populists, but there's also supply for populists. There just happens to be a person who may be a great political entrepreneur, who is smart, clever, has good technology, and she or he manages to provide supply of populist program. And this supply may be, to some extent, I will somehow qualify it in a moment, to some extent independent on the demand. And that is why sometimes we cannot explain why it has happened that, for example, in Poland, a movement such as led by Kaczynski won in 2015, because we are looking only at the demand side, at structural aspect, but we are not looking at the supply, at what sort of party and what sort of leader emerged, right? I mean, in the UK, there was no, even though there was Brexit and there was a good deal of demagogues, Farage, etc., there was never a good supply of really attractive populist leaders, and therefore there is no populist in power, okay? At least. And so, moving now to the conclusion, I'm not trying to say that all that matters is supply. Supply without a demand will not satisfy the reasons or the conditions for a success. We have great supplies of anchovies in the market, but we all hate anchovies. Anchovies will not get good prices on the market. On the other hand, supply also matters, because if there is no supply of anchovies, you don't even know that there is such a thing. So why would you demand it? So what really matters in politics, just like in the economic market, is resonance. And that is called the resonance theory, that there should be a good degree of resonance between supply and demand, or demand and supply. And only looking at both these sides can we, with some degree of accuracy, identify or answer the question, why did populism was was successful in this country, but not in the other one. Why was it successful in the United States? It wasn't successful in Canada. We must look at both sides of this divide. Okay, I think I might wind down at this point my presentation, but I'm now happy to engage with you in a conversation. Again, you are welcome to make your points either in English or in Italian, whichever you prefer. If in Italian, you should speak not too fast, okay? Yes, please.
If you don't mind, present yourself. Hmm? Oh, yeah, that's...
I'm Corsaro Sara, a new PhD student here in Macerata in Global Studies. So I would like to know your opinion about this. I'm thinking about the Italian case. During the latest elections, abstention was a key factor. I'm thinking about the last election, abstention was up to 40%. I would like to know if you have noticed if abstention is some kind of fil rouge in populisms worldwide, or if it's just a key factor of Italy. And I also would like to know your opinion about this. I'm always thinking about Italy. It seemed to me that the opposition parties also focus their electoral campaign on defeating the populist, and this also translates into a lack of focus on their own electoral programs. And I would like to know if this is the case also in some other countries.
Yep. So let me say thank you very much for this double question. Let me first of all make a very general proviso. I really do not want to engage in a discussion about Italy, not because I'm afraid, you know, that something will happen to me if I say something improper, but I just don't know enough. You know, I had spent some time in Italy, but it was a long time ago, and I know about Italy not more than any reasonably interested newspaper reader around the world knows. So, you know, each of you will have much better and much more intelligent answers to these two questions, that is, to the questions of abstention, electoral abstention, and the anti-populist program, than I do in terms of Italy. But let me not completely avoid answering this question, but try to make it a little bit more universal, because by the end of your second question, or second part of your question, you urged me to compare other countries. So first of all, I believe that there is a degree of evidence in empirical political science that high abstention favors non-democratic parties, while high turnout favors disproportionately pro-democratic countries. Now, I've read one article which made such a point, and this is something I wanted to talk about in my third day of these lectures when I'll be talking about the programs. So I don't think that the evidence is particularly strong, but I feel that we can speculate, we can sort of second guess why extra turnout compared to a particular default point may benefit Democrats more than populists. One such speculative reason I can think of is that populists usually have much more disciplined and mobilized electorate. That's their nature, okay? Think about populist parties in Italy, okay? As compared to mainstream parties, Christian democracy, Democratic Party, Socialist, etc. It seems that populists, with this energy and enthusiasm of these allegedly new people, they managed to mobilize their electorate more than those milder parties, more lukewarm, sort of. But if that's the case, that it means that they have very little reserve to mobilize from the pool of non-voters. They, meaning populists. They have more or less exhausted the resources in terms of electorate, almost. While Democrats must go an extra mile to get people, move their body from their home to the ballot poll and to vote. So they have perhaps a higher pool on which they can base their campaign, and therefore they probably will benefit more from a higher turnout. Again, I'm saying it a little bit. It's sort of like beyond my pay scale, and so I do not actually know what I'm talking about, because I'm not an empirical political science working on the comparative elections in the world. But from what I've read, I think there is some degree of truth in it. And so that would explain why I think low turnout equals higher chances of populists, and that may explain the outcome of the September elections. Now, much more difficult is your second point, and that is that many people, let me paraphrase what you said, many people were concerned or upset that the anti-populist parties talk about their anti-populism rather than about their own program. And people don't like it, so they don't go to vote for someone who only is negative about someone else, but doesn't say, so okay, we already know. You don't like Fratelli, you don't like Salvini, you don't like Cinque Stelle. Now tell us what you do like. And if you don't say that, we will not vote for it. This is a frequent theme which I see and hear in the discussions about why anti-populists often lose. I think that when we look at the actual facts about various elections, we can find that there were some elections which are successful for anti-populists, even if their only program was against populists. Example, Israel against Netanyahu. Okay, now we see that this victory was extremely shallow and that anti-Netanyahu government came to an end, but at least they've won. Okay? And when they've won and defeated this extremely popular leader, Netanyahu, the only common denominator for the anti-Netanyahu coalition was being anti-Netanyahu. They had Arab Party, something unique, but still existing in the Israeli political system, in Knesset, which is very left-wing, and they have extreme right-wing, and the whole spectrum in between. And the only thing that they agreed upon was that they don't like Netanyahu, in my view, for very good reasons, because he wasn't, in my view, again, a likable or a good leader. But that somehow managed to get them the victory. Why? Well, because I think much depends on how you actually articulate your platform being anti. So if you say, we just don't like Netanyahu, it's perhaps matching your description of anti-populists in Italy. They are anti. But you can always phrase your anti-program in a positive program. We are for the improvement of democracy. We are for being pro-EU. We are for being pro-independent courts, etc., etc. So in a sense, all these reasons which warrant your disapproval of the incumbents may and should, I think, be converted into a positive program. And then it's no longer, but I know it very well from Poland. In Poland, we will have election in 2023, and this will be, again, this all or nothing election. Either Kaczynski and his people will get the third term, and perhaps it will be the last democratic election in Poland, and Poland will cease being member of the EU, etc., or the Democrats will win. And again, we have these discussions, we, political parties there, and those people who try as observers or commentators to advise them. We talk about the importance of the unity of the coalition. But of course, unity of anti-government coalition has a price to pay, and that is that the more comprehensive it is, the shallower it is programmatically, because there are fewer things on which you can agree. But if you can convince the population, I'm not just against peace, which is a Polish acronym for law and justice. I'm in favor of strong place in European Union, democracy, rule of law, etc. Then I think, you at least escape this type of objection. Please, other points? Yes, sir. I think you'll need a mic. Yeah.
I'm Alessandro. I'm a student of this university as well. I would like to ask you, if we really would like to improve our democracy, for instance, to reduce the gap that there is between people and elite, should we, for instance, treat populism as a sort of Trojan horse? So in other terms, should we consider them as our enemies or our opponents? This is my question.
Yeah. Well, I don't like ever responding by saying it's a very good question, because I think it's sort of cliche, which sounds patronizing, but I think it is a very good question. How should we look at populists, whether our enemies or our opponents? Not our enemies, because they are our compatriots. And it's always bad to treat your compatriot, even if you think not merely that they are mistaken, but that there's something bad, morally bad about their choices, as our enemy. Because the difference between an opponent and enemy is that with the opponent, your main mission is to convert them. With the enemy, your main mission is to destroy them. And we don't want to have an approach that we want to destroy a part of our own society. So that's an answer to whether we should treat them as opponents or enemies. But you preceded this question by this idea, so aren't populists a Trojan horse in a democracy? And in some ways, yes, they are, because I think they ultimately destroy democracy. But before they destroy, they dismantle it in many ways, which I had already started talking about and which I will develop tomorrow. They are anti-democratic. And in that sense, I don't buy one of a very, very influential view in the study of populism is that populism is actually some sort of aid to us Democrats, because it identifies the deficits in our democracy. For example, it's too elitist, or to this or to that. So, they are like a little bit like a mild disease, which may be actually good because it can identify something more fundamental in your body, some more fundamental illness. And if you know it, in time, you manage to find therapy. I don't buy it. I don't think that this is a good metaphor. I think that they are undemocratic, full stop. But there is a difference between populist leaders and populist electorate. And that's the most important thing, that we must, when, for example, if you are an Italian citizen and you deplore the election result of the last election, for the sake of argument, if you do, then you should draw the line between those who voted for Ms. Meloni and herself. Just as I have to draw a distinction between those who vote for Kaczynski and his people, and on the other hand, Kaczynski and his people. So people vote for populists not because they are stupid. They have some very important problems. I try to identify these problems under these 5 factors, and They are real problems. Even anti-modernism, you know, I am a modernist person. I'm secular, pro-enlightenment, anti-discrimination, etc., etc. But I can appreciate why some people feel threatened by these tendencies, you know, and it's no good to say they are stupid, you know, or they are my enemy. We need to convert them, but of course, the same doesn't apply to populist politicians and populist leaders. They are certainly not stupid. They wouldn't be where they are if they were, but they are cynical, and they use cynically. Like Donald Trump, you know, I mean, Donald Trump is, fortunately, the institutional system of the United States turned out to be so resilient and so strong that he could go into all his follies, and in the end, he didn't do too much damage. He did damage to individuals, but not to institutions. But, you know, he is a very, very deeply cynical person. And that's what we should fight with. Other points or questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I study political science here in Macerata. And first of all, thanks for coming here. And my question is, we saw that populism and populists respond only to real problems. But what are for populists real problems? How they define them? How they define problems, real ones? And
how they define what? Sorry.
How they define real problems?
Okay, we'll be talking about it both tomorrow and after tomorrow. But there, to put it very briefly, to sort of like to foreshadow our discussion tomorrow and especially on Thursday, is that, you know, what happens with populist discourse, populist supply, is they mix accurate and real problems with inventions, with fallacies. For example, all conspiracy theories have always some aspect of reality. They are not like completely fairy tale, so that people can identify with a real life experience and say, yes, indeed, you know, I mean, I saw maybe something about immigrants or something about secularists or something about whatever they identify as their problem. They do lose their job. I mean, I've read very recently the analysis which shows how the economic status of Democratic versus Republican counties, that is districts of voters in the United States, how it grew apart in the recent 10 years, how the median income it's not about Democrats and the Republicans, in democratically voting counties and in Republican voting countries, how it grew apart, so that the typical Democratic voter was well-educated, well remunerated, usually in things such as IT business, sort of knowledge-based business, etc. While Republican typical voter was not less educated, not college educated, had the increasingly low salary, was mainly in manufacturing and farming. So these groups, these two social groups, went apart in an objective way. Even before politics enters into it, they started diverging from each other. But then populists mentioned to re-articulate this relative deprivation or relative loss into the language of stealing. They have stolen something from you. Not you just lost your job or lost your income. It was stolen from you. That's what Trump kept saying. You know, they have stolen from you. And if they have stolen, then the next step is take it back. So it's a resentment. And we see the ultimate of the resentment and of taking back on the 6th of January in Congress, in the outside and inside Congress of the United States. So I think that's one example in which populists present problems. They always take something real, but then they connect it with some talk about conspiracy, often, I mean, in Poland, the main talk is about foreign intervention. You know, all these bad Germans, bad EU, etc. So it's, you know, there are different ways of presenting problems. So you start with a real thing, and then it grows into the into paranoia, basically. And but that will be my, as I say, I'll try to be more detailed in it on Thursday. Anyone else? We have plenty of time.
Up there.
Ah, up there,
Up
okay. But will it record? I don't know. For me, it's enough, but for recording, maybe not. It's almost like someone coming from heaven to visit us.
So, good morning, Professor Sadowski. Thank you for this lecture. I would like to pose a question. I was a PhD student here in Macerata, and now I'm a research fellow in another university. I would like to pose a question which is somehow related to the current situation in Italy, but can also be applied to other contexts. And it's a question concerning the populist nature of coalition governments. So, how is it possible to assess the populist nature of a coalition government? Because, for example, here in Italy, we have now a coalition made up of 3 parties, which one of them is clearly a populist party, others maybe are not. So my question is, do we have to rely only on the weight, on the percentage of those parties? So saying, okay, we have a 20% of this coalition is made up of a populist party, the other percentage of non-populist, and then assess, or whether we have to assess the concrete action made by this coalition in order to assess its populist nature. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we may have, of course, different criteria.
I go upstairs.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll just wait before you take your heavenly place. Okay, so of course you raised the issue about what criteria do we have to characterize a particular government as being populist or non-populist. And of course, the matter is very simple. If we have just one clearly populist party and we have this one-party government, and then we can be relatively safe in our conviction, then therefore it's a populist government. What about if we have a mixed government, a government of non-populists and populists alike? I feel that this approach, by trying to find standards of populism of a government by the, if you like, populist or non-populist pedigree or origins of various parties and leaders, is a bit misleading. Because in my view, in this institutional approach to populism, what really matters is what populists do rather than what they say. So I would say, okay, Giorgia Meloni came to power under a populist platform. Let's see what she does. Maybe she will turn into a perfect, moderate, liberal Democrat. Who knows? Boris Johnson was generally considered to be populist because he was demagogue. He used various aspects of the program which were seen populist because they were popular in the society, that is about Brexit, about immigration, etc. Although he came to power post-Brexit, but he wasn't particularly populist in his policies. He didn't do anything particularly populist to the way the government works. And the most populist legal attempt in the UK, which was to circumvent the parliament in ratifying Brexit by simply appeal to referendum, was killed immediately by the Supreme Court, and no one in the government tried to revive it when the Supreme Court said, no, sorry, the law is made by the parliament, and we need parliamentary way for Brexit. The referendum in itself has a zero legal force. Okay, I'm a little bit exaggerating, but that's so. In my books, he was not a populist, even though his language may have been seen as populist. So, on the other hand, you may have democratic liberal politicians who absorb in their government populist demands. And then they only say, yeah, we do it only in order to weaken the basis for populists. But then it may well be that they in fact became populist, and their policies, even if they claim that they are a way of avoiding populist turn, maybe the situation in which the cure is worse than medicine, medicine is worse than the illness. Mark Rutte of the Netherlands is an example. A politician who came in a perfectly liberal democratic program. Increasingly, from one election to another, he kept buying populist slogans, thus weakening the base for real populists. Forgot his name, this populist leader in the Netherlands. But in the process, he became sort of like a half populist. So I'm looking at policies rather than at their language, which we may define populist or non-populist. I'm not sure, for example, but again, I don't want to enter on a very thin ice, that the previous populist government here, before Mario Draghi, that it was partly populist, because it seems to me that the right-wing populism and left-wing populism in the coalition government more or less cancelled each other out. But it is completely ignorant speculation, and I'm happy to be convinced that I'm wrong. Yes. What do you think, Benedetta? Shall we
I think
call it a day?
I cannot see.
I'm very happy to continue, but I also don't want to impose myself on you if you've got enough. So unless...
Well, I don't see any... Well, maybe a time will come tomorrow for some more questions to be elaborated and ruminated about. So I think for the time being, let's thank Professor Sadusky very much again for his generosity. And
thank you. Thank you.
And see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So look.